Very much, Gene, and the fellow participants who are on the call. You are on the fifth episode of tryScrum Webinar Studio, powered by Agile Leadership Studio, Scrum Master Studio, and Product Ownership Studio with Venkatesh Rajamani and the crew members on the call. Today, we are going to talk about exposing uncomfortable topics. I would say this is one of the controversial topics. Scaling, because in every class or every conference and every webinars that we attend, the first question we get from participants, how do we scale? So I have Gene General with me. Before I introduce about the speaker, let me give you a little bit of background about the technical logistics. You'll be on mute throughout the webinar to give some good experience for the fellow participants to avoid the background noises. You can post your questions on the fly on the Q&A window. We will dedicate some time at the end to answer some of your questions. We will try to fit most of your questions within the time box, but given the fact we have just 1 hour, we may be not taking all the questions. It depends, but we will try our best. This webinar is hosted by tryScrum.com. As many of you know, this is the 100% non-profit initiative. tryScrum mission is to humanize organizations. So we strongly believe the power and humanizing nature of people can really do wonders in organizations. So that's one of the initiatives. We started this webinar series, and we have a whole bunch of speakers lined up. We are also a PDN member of Scrum.org, and we are also a member organization of Scrum Alliance, IC Agile. You can visit tryScrum.com for more information. As I mentioned to you, there are 3 studios in tryScrum. This particular webinar is hosted from Agile Leadership Studio because especially this is a scaling topic. So we think most of the leaders would be interested in scaling. About the speaker, I would say a colleague of mine, Gene General, is also a CEC with Scrum Alliance, certified LESS trainer with LESS. And he has got more than 20 years of professional experience. I think one of the earliest CECs, Gene, I can call like that.
I'm not one of the early Cs. Well, I'm actually the first CEC given the new beginning of CEC program. Wow. It was number 65, but not the first one. Used to be CSC, Certified Scrum Coach, became Certified Enterprise Coach for the obvious reasons, because it's not just Scrum. So that's not the first one. 2010 wasn't successful to me. 2014 was.
That's quite a long back. Nice to have you. And what I know about Gene, not talking about the formal stuff, Gene is very passionate about especially humanizing organizations, and he has contributed a lot to the community. For example, Agile Coaching, the wisdom from the Agile practitioners, that's a wonderful book. Wisdom, the collection of wisdom from some of the guides from the Scrum Alliance communities, and consistent best articles of 2017, 18, and 19, I think from Tandem Coaching Academy. I'm not sure the source of that. Yep. And he's also one of the co-creators of CTC program. CTC is Certified Team Coach with Scrum Alliance. And of course, he is one of the guides in the Scrum Alliance community. So very happy to have you, Gene, today as a speaker at tryScrum. We are glad, and we extend our gratitude for your time.
Thank, I appreciate, and you actually did an immense amount of help to me introducing, because I'm horrible at introducing myself. I will share my screen now, so you should be able to see my screen coming up as we speak. Just let me know. It should be up now, right? Okay.
Thank you. Over to you.
Hold on, I'm having some. Hello, can you?
Yes, I can hear you well, and see your screen as well.
Okay, good. So can you see my screen now? It says exposing uncomfortable topics.
Yes.
Okay, good. Something just happened with Zoom. It came and went. So, all right, cool. All right, let me get started then. So without any further ado, let me push forward. And I promise to, hold on, I need to figure out how to move the cascading window here. And I promise to budget enough time. What is it not moving? Oh, there it is. I promised to budget enough time at the end so we can take some questions. So this saved me a lot. So thank you for sharing little something about me. I'm terrible at doing self intros, and the 30-second elevator drop has never been successful for me. So you did the needed. I'm just going to say this. You're right. So I would like to make myself very accessible right off the bat. Email is available. It's up there. It's _GG_NYC. LinkedIn. You can contact me through my website. I also have a free Slack channel. People are welcome to join, just if you want to collaborate or ask questions or create internal groups and communicate internally. I run a meetup, I think it's the largest one in the world, the large scale Scrum meetup. It's about descaling, not about scaling, but you're welcome to follow the link. I do online training as well and coaching, so you can follow through on that. And somewhere, a little bit shamelessly, I'm going to introduce, so this week actually I have a online training that's coming up. Maybe not at the most ideal timing for the folks in the Eastern time zone, in the Far East time zone. It's 12 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but it's doable. So I'm going to leave it at that if you're interested. And without any further ado, I will move on to the meat and potatoes, to the main content of this subject. And so I am, if you know me a little bit, and although I try to be very, I always keep myself within boundaries of appropriateness and political correctness when I speak, present, or teach. But at the same time, I believe in servicing people by means of giving them the most authentic, the most unsanitized content, truth that they should be able to leverage to make their own determinations. So that means that when it comes to some of these sensitive or touchy subjects, I tend to speak. I tend to speak the truth, as I would like to call the truth, but some people may argue this is really not true. Well, it is my truth, and I try to speak as candidly as I can, and sometimes it comes at a cost of being politically correct. So, but I do try to expose, and I do try to give people things at their face value. So here's my short list of what I consider as the biggest emissions of what we consider, what I consider to be the biggest emissions with scaling. It is my personal belief that for the most part, the word enterprise is being misunderstood by organizations and oftentimes individuals. Enterprise is often viewed as huge, big, monolithic, monumental. For instance, if an organization is 20,000 people, when we speak of an enterprise, we inevitably have to say 20,000. We inevitably have to refer to 20,000 people, which may not necessarily be true, because if you can circumvent a part of the organization that is somewhere autonomous and independent of other organizational parts, you may actually consider this as an enterprise. At certain organizational level, when you can touch certain facets, certain knobs, certain controls that are systemic, you may rightfully consider this as an enterprise. I know the word enterprise is pretty popular these days. It's an enterprise coach, enterprise scrum master, enterprise this, that, just because it has become a trend. The same thing goes with scaling. In fact, with the word scaling, it has become even more challenging. The word scaling has been added to the lexicon, to the dialect of almost every person, every organization, and quite frankly, it is the misunderstanding of the term that to me is the biggest challenge about scaling itself. Oftentimes people think that scaling means making things bigger. If you have already some, if you have volume of something, if you want to make this bigger, doesn't mean you are scaling. So in order to scale goodness, you have to have goodness foundationally. And this is what sometimes I see not happening. So organizations are trying to scale what is already dysfunctional. So you just amplify and you're increasing your low level, your rudimentary dysfunction, which brings me to my next point: omissions with fundamentals. Not understanding, not being able to to implement successfully one team Scrum or simple Kanban. If you try to scale this function, if you try to scale this problem, you're just going to have a problem to the power of. Some other key problems I've seen in the past with scaling: putting Agile in the basement. Let me explain what I mean with the next few slides. When you're trivializing or marginalizing the importance of agility or adaptiveness, and you just build on top of it, you make this a small piece of the organizational structure, that kind of defeats the purpose. Copy pasting and relabeling. Also, I have a few own your own understanding as opposed to renting from me. Some of the challenges there. Fractal Scrum with local optimization. I'll have an example and I'll explain what the word fractal means. And of course, the good old one, new game with same old players. It's a contractual game, especially when we deal with external third parties that are involved in product development or procurement. Okay, let me put a little more gasoline to the fire, right? Before we start extinguishing this fire, let me put some more gas to it. This is not a well perceived slide by some, and oftentimes I hear, well, this is too inflaming or too revealing, and why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because this is it's a well-known systemic problem that not too many are willing to admit. There is a systemic industry-wide problem, and I call it triple taxation. Here in the United States, we pay taxes. In some in some localities, you pay triple tax: city, state, and government. So I kind of refer to it to a triple taxation. We oftentimes see companies fall a victim of big bang agile transformations, sometimes propelled by large consultancies. They're typically based on these large, monolithic, monumental, heavy, so-called agile frameworks. And needless to say, they come in the same bandwagon with heavy agile frameworks, heavy agile tooling. So it almost like you pay 3 times. And when you do your ROI, or if you do your bottom line in, let's say, in a couple of years, you will realize you haven't really moved a notch or moved very little, and you're not even sure if you moved in the right direction. So just beware of this challenge. Of course, this is also coupled with this very serious issue, in my view. And although, so please do not confuse it with a TDD, test-driven development, which is an amazing thing. It's a great agile engineering, it's a great engineering technique, great development technique. I refer to this as DDT. I think I coined this term and makes many people laugh. It's referred as deck-driven transformations. And in my experience, the thickness of a deck is usually inversely proportional to the, to the degree of knowledge retention or improvement. So if you see your organization falling into, going down the path of heavy decks, lots of wiki pages, lots of box notes, lots of paper, paper trail, as opposed to actually doing something in a Gemba where action takes place, it should raise an alarm. This is a good old Scrum. I should not spend any time discussing it today. I think everyone here on the call understands what Scrum dynamics should look like. One backlog, one product owner, customer-centric development, teams are stable, long-lived, cross-functional, cross-component working, one PSPI. That's Scrum in a nutshell, although I'm sure there's a Scrum guide to tell you more. Now, this is what scaling is not. If you just copy-paste one team Scrum, even if it's a healthy Scrum, but Scrum done by teams that work on different products, small products for a different product owner out of different backlogs, this is not scaling. You might very well consider these as independent Scrum teams doing their own work. And we oftentimes see organizations fall in the trap of calling this scaling because this is just a trendy word. And by saying, well, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams, we scaled up Scrum. No, you haven't. You at best have 5 teams working on 5 independent products for 5 different customers in a very different way. So different cadence. Just because you put them on the same cadence and they start on Monday and finish the following Friday, it's not scaling. Just we have 5 independent teams. This is just hopefully an aha moment for you. Scaling means something else. Scaling means amplifying the same effort so that you can work. Well, let me just not steal my own thunder. Let me get to an example of real scaling just in a little bit. Here's another example of potentially what you may see sometimes and not necessarily identify. So number one is obviously it's an easy one to understand. It's almost like a mini waterfall, sequential project phase gated development, analysis, design, development, testing, and then PSPI, hopefully. So this is easy to identify. Say, hey, you're just micro waterfalling within Scrum. This may not be such an obvious thing because it may seem like a bunch of teams scrumming, sprinting on the same cadence. However, if you look under the hood, each one of them is a component team. UI UX design team, scaling. Database team, scaling. I'm sorry, sprinting. Web services team, sprinting. API team, sprinting. And guess what? Just because each team works on their own component, there's a huge fallout of integration and bug fixing problem towards the end. And hopefully you're going to get PSPI towards the end here, but also very risky because you're waiting until the tail end of it. So none of it is Scrum. This is fake Scrum, or we sometimes refer to as fake scaling, because just because you have 5 teams here, it doesn't mean you are truly scaling, just like a previous slide. With this approach, we oftentimes see these problems. And I'm not going to read each one of them. I'm going to just paraphrase it. Of course, you're going to have the deck so you can refer to it. Product definition is weak. It's mostly around territorial code ownership. Guess why do you think these 5 teams do not touch each other's code? It's most likely because of code ownership that is fake code security. Oftentimes, it's not because these teams cannot do it. It's just mostly because organizationally, structurally, they are traditionally not doing it. Technologies are smart enough, and at least the ones that I've met in my life, to cross-teach, cross-learn different technologies. So there are organizational design reasons behind that. And there's some other challenges here, like no meaningful HR changes to support Scrum team design. This is a big one. You may think, well, component team E cannot touch component team B because they are not skilled enough. Probably not true. If you give them an opportunity to learn, and you properly incentivize them and give them time, they will be able to do it. But it comes back to organizational design issues and HR ways of working. Sometimes it has to do with incentives. Moving on. So this is this is the typical classic example of what I see. So this is actually a few problems in one sheet, so just bear with me. I refer to this as a masquerade. If you take your organizational structure that is vertically aligned and flip it on its side 90 degrees and call it let's say a chapter, you have not created a true community. You have not created a true chapter. You most likely relabel an existing organizational traditional function into a horizontal one, and really nothing has changed. Now with this is a typical pass we see companies do, we see companies take. With that, we also see this coming. You take an existing organizational, or an existing group that is usually geographically dispersed, and sometimes it's built out of different vendors, and you just relabel it into a squad. Then of course you take this squad, this is the moment of truth. You take this bunch of these squads and you shove them into the tribe. Because by definition, and not your definition, hopefully, a tribe is something big, and that implies you scaling. Now, people for some reason completely ignore and don't pay attention to what historically the Spotify company, not the model. There's no such thing as Spotify model. It's a big, big misnomer, and it comes from the folks that actually have coined the Spotify ways of working back in the days. So they shove it in the so-called tribe, and these ad hoc, not really working together well squads now being considered as a scaled approach. So in my view, it's of course it's pretty merciless relabeling we see here, because we really haven't changed anything underneath, the same exact dynamics. So with that, of course, you shouldn't be expecting the goodness of true scaling, because you really haven't scaled. You just relabeled, rehashed, remapped, and refurbished, and you sort of repackaged what you already had in the first place. This is just a pass-through slide. Interestingly enough, we got some situations and companies where some ways of scaling, right, come with a certification. It's almost at birth, and I'm being facetious here. Person gets coined his certification, great. Now we have an army of people that are certified in certain ways of scaling, and they are off they go, really not changing organizational dynamics. I kind of, so this is a pass-through slide. I don't expect you to read it in its entirety. It's just, I'm a cartoonist also. Other than doing my paid work, I also do cartoons and graphics, and I enjoy it. So this is my way of depicting, graphically illustrating some of the dysfunctions you may have if an organization blindly copy-pastes someone else's experiment back years and years ago at a small company, at a small music company, where it actually worked because it was a small company. So it's an interesting way how we sometimes see operating, something that was pretty good and something that was pretty healthy and successful because there were very, very original native reasons why people did it. And now it has becomes almost like a religion for some, and we end up with these very heavy, very monolithic, very cumbersome organizational structures that really, they're not meant to work successfully. And there was a lot of relabeling that goes in it. So imagine you did have some greatness, right? So imagine you had some good Scrum teams, maybe, or Kanban teams working very effectively. Now, and you had customers, right? So you would assume that between a customer and Gemba, where action takes place, you have to have very short catwalk. It's called close proximity, right? Low proximity. You should be able to talk directly to them. Now, if you overlay your Agile teams with all of these challenges, with all of these blocks of organizational structures and roles and additional responsibilities and KPIs and RAGs and metrics and just organizational complexity, and I'm being very agnostic. I'm probably anchoring you a little bit with my terms here. You probably are getting a smile on your face. Oh, I know what you're talking about here. Well, if you do this, what's going to be your Gemba to customer path? How proximal are you going to be? You're going to be extremely long. It's going to be extremely long and convoluted. With this, you should see these questions coming up, right? Where's customer centricity? How long is the feedback loop between real Gemba and where action takes place and where value gets delivered and consumed? How adaptive, really? How fast reactive can you be to your customer needs if you have this very convoluted organizational structure? And the most important question is what really has changed fundamentally from the ways you used to work in the past? Okay, and this is one version. There will be more to come. I mentioned at the beginning I will be very framework agnostic, and I will not be using names, but I will just implicitly refer to Dave Snowden, who did a great job a couple of weeks back speaking at the large-scale Scrum of New York City meetup, explaining some of these problems and explaining why these large frameworks actually find their way into organizations. There was a political ecosystem. There was a dynamic that sits behind, and we need to understand why. He actually did a great job. There's a video that I strongly recommend you watching. It's down below. Another example, another illustration, and the permutation of scaling dysfunction. Now, I remember I referenced the word fractal. Fractal is when you take a kaleidoscope. It's like what kids usually play with, and you twist it, and you have symmetrical images that appear, in different corners of the prism of the lens. Well, this kind of looks like it, right? So you may think of what's an SM? SM probably stands for Scrum Master. What's the TOO? And oh my God, what is a TO? We don't know what that is. Well, TO is not a PO. It's not a product owner. A TO stands for Team Output Owner. So this is called Fractal Scrum, when every team has one product owner and one Scrum Master, and you end up with Scrum and Scrum of Scrums and Scrum and Scrum of Scrum of Scrums and Scrum and Scrum of Scrum of Scrum Scrums. You end up with lots of mandatory coordination that brings a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of overhead and waste. Coordination on top of coordination, and of course with that, with this come lots of private backlogs, dedicated team output owners that are responsible for output, not outcome, and Scrum Masters. This is also going to lead to a high degree of local optimization. In order to understand local optimization well, you probably need to spend a little bit of time reading, or maybe assessing yourself and the organization. Like, if I'm only locally optimized for my own role, I'll do the best I can to do it great. Like, I'm responsible for building a power engine for a vehicle. I'm going to do it at expense of a transmission, of interior design, of tire design. Everything will be just around the engine, and I may build a small car with 5,000 horsepower engine, which will really not run well. So this is local optimization. With this kind of design, every team is very locally optimized. Most likely they work on components, not on features, and therefore they are least likely Scrum teams. They're most likely component teams, because in Scrum we work on features, not on components. TOO is a longer conversation to have. We're not covering this today, but just think of it this way: someone who is not really able to set priorities or set strategic mission and vision. Oftentimes we have people that step in this role because a real product owner is not able to be identified. An engagement manager, an engineer, a business analyst, or some other administrative person who is responsible for your Agile tool, but not a real product owner. And it's a vicious cycle why this is happening, because when you work on components, why would you expect that a real product owner is going to step up and set priorities? They just don't understand when you speak components. They don't understand enough, and they shouldn't understand enough about technology to set priorities. A product owner is your business person, is your customer. I strongly advise you to actually play this amazing video by Michael James. Let me go to the next slide. It's actually a bigger view. It talks about misconceptions of the role of a product owner in the organization, and how this leads to fractal Scrum and dysfunctional scaling. There's also a cartoon book that you can download for free. Last but not least, on the subject of ill-defined scaling, I would like to mention scaling legal contracts. Now, we all work for, or we have worked or consulted for organizations that have reliance on external vendors or third parties. Now, imagine this: you have a client company, right? This is a poor man's way to graphically illustrate this. You got a bunch of vendors. In fact, this is a misnomer. I should be relabeling this. It's a vendor A, B, C, D, and E. I'm sorry, this is actually not a, it shouldn't be A. It's considered A, B, C, D, and E. Now, the typical organizational, the typical engagement model is this: you got an engagement lead that represents this vendor sitting on a client side, pretty much making all decisions. He or she is a frontier of a relationship. He or she is responsible for scope management, for estimations, for other things that we typically would expect a team to be responsible for. Okay, so he or she is the best of the best of the best, facing a client coming from a vendor. Now imagine this hypothetical cloud in the open space with a bunch of so-called teams, which in reality just people stapled together with very little understanding of each other's intentions and goals. They represent individual vendors, very differently managed by their respective vendor companies. But just because you have many people and they are kind of artificially stapled into these so-called teams, most likely groups of people that work on a very different legal contract, because these yellow circles represent the yellow company, the green ones represent the green company. They have their internal responsibilities. These externally facing SLAs isn't something they can control. So this is really by far not real. It's not real scaling. It's just grouping people together. Another aha moment, hopefully for you, when you go back to your respective organizations, is try to assess what if you have this scenario, if you have this pattern, maybe you want to challenge this. Now, having said all of this, I mean, it's almost like we blasted out of the sky so many different anti-patterns. What do we have to give as an alternative? In fact, are there any alternatives? Well, there are. Okay, so first of all, it's very important to understand that organizational structure is the first order factor that defines system dynamics. Things like culture, mindset, behaviors, those are all great things, but they do not come first. They come secondarily. Org design is the most definitive thing. It's like we're all mature people here, all grown-ups. We have our own cultures and behaviors and ways of working. If we're all put in the same organizational ecosystem, in order for us to change the way we operate, the org structure has to give us the boundaries. It has to give us the guideline, guardrails, incentives. Otherwise, we're going to remain who we are. And unfortunately, this isn't something we often see even coaches educate to senior management. They start with values and processes and policies, at best, mindset and behaviors. But if you haven't changed organizational settings around, there isn't much that's going to change. You may tweak a little bit, but overall, people will act the way they're, if you put yourself into a given media, into a given ecosystem, you're going to adopt. There's an expression, when you're in Rome, you have to act like Romans. And this has been very historical. I'm actually taking this from the Craig Larman post back in 2015 on the Scrum Alliance website. Craig Larman is one of the co-founders of Large Scale Scrum. I call this a sushi roll. You have to treat your organization as a sushi roll or as a tiramisu layered cake. When we talk about slicing stories, we sometimes talk about sushi rolls. I also use the same analogy when I talk about organizational structure. In order for us to change something systemically and deeply, we need to touch some of the additional facets, not just IT, not just development. We have to look at legal practices, product management, HR policies, site strategies, and many other facets that are typically left out because, oh my God, these are not touchable. We can't go there. Well, if you're not going there, you're most likely going to change something very superficially, just to put a check mark in an Excel spreadsheet that we've done it. But it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be systemic. And most likely it will fade away over time. Okay. So once we understand basic Scrum, right? Basic Scrum is something that we take near and dear to our hearts. We understand when it works, why it works, and why it doesn't work. This is actually the more important thing to understand, why Scrum doesn't work in our organization. It's easy to just go ahead and change. Okay, well, it doesn't work for us. Let's change it. Well, it was defined in a very simple way. And the reason why it's not working, maybe there's something systemically wrong that you actually need to tweak internally. So instead of changing the change the reason why it's not working. So, but let's just assume we understand basic Scrum. This is hopefully the moment of truth. Not scaling Scrum would be many teams doing their own stuff. Scaling Scrum would be, let's just take an example of 2 to 8 teams scrumming together on the same product. I use the 2 to 8 for a reason. I'll explain in a second why. Maybe not the best analogy here is this. You got 5, 6 horses with 5 or 6 different jockeys that set strategy, vision, mission, and priorities. If they sprint separately, in fact, they may even compete for speed, for velocity. This is not scaling. This is when you got a bunch of teams, and I gave an example, 2 to 8, pulling the horse carriage together in the same direction, being operated by the same jockey. Maybe a jockey is not the best way to describe a product owner, but just for the sake of argument, having the same vision and mission and strategy. This is scaling. You scaled an effort of 1 horse up to 6 or 5, 6 horses, but mission, and vision hasn't changed. Strategic goals have not changed. Same direction, same purpose, same intention, same everything. Neither one of these horses is trying to bypass or outbeat another one. They want to go together. And that's the fundamental shift, fundamental difference in the way the left picture and the right picture work. On the left-hand side, each horse wants to be better, or each horse wants to go faster, locally optimized for their own goodness. 2 to 8 teams. Again, why 2 to 8? I'll explain in a second. It's pretty simple. But imagine you got 4 teams here, A, B, C, and D, sprinting together on the same cadence. doing constantly continuous integration. By the way, integrating continuously means, 3-5 minutes apart, maybe 10 minutes apart, but not 2-3 days apart. They refine together, they plan together, they coordinate directly, not through different different conduits or different translation layers. Of course, they work on parallel, not on staggered sprints, and they deliver something that's potentially shippable at the end of every sprint. Now, these 4 teams, I'm using example 4, it falls between 2 to 8, so it makes sense, right? Another graphic illustration. You may have teams even of different size, but if they pull the same product in the same direction, for the same product owner, only one person, supported for clarification by some users that are pretty fine up front, with lots of internal coordination and support and help. This is scaling. You just scaled an effort and capability of one boat, of one team, 5 times, or maybe it's not even linear, maybe it's super linear. I'm not expecting to read these bubbles. You can read them later when you get the deck. But from here, you will understand not only each team is a well-oiled machine, it's the entire product group, the entire set of teams is a well-oiled machine, or oiled machine, because they work together. So without actually saying the word, saying the term, I'm going to introduce it now. What I have described with the last few slides, it's large-scale Scrum. It is Scrum, but it's done by more than one team that works on the same product for the same product owner out of the same product backlog. Not individual product owners per team, not multiple product backlogs that will create lots of local optimization in each. It's just one large-scale Scrum product group. And hint, hint, it's between 2 to 8 people. Why? 2 to 8 teams. Why? Less than 2 would be just one team Scrum. More than 8, by doing lots of research and many experiments, we have realized 8 is roughly that number when you started to exceed capabilities of what one product owner can do. And this is an immediate question we get. Oh my God, how come can one product owner support up to 8 teams? We actually covered in less training, which becomes a huge aha moment for people. That always sits on the premise of understanding what a product owner is and what he or she is meant to be in Scrum, and how he or she can actually support, do their function well in large-scale Scrum settings. Now, this isn't just a claim that comes, from one person's experience. Large-scale Scrum has lots of. So first of all, it's a history. It is not a commercial product that was created for the sake of selling and installing. And that's another hint. Some other frameworks are super successful financially and commercially, but they don't have a track record that supports the same claim. Back in 2008, the first book was written. So in other words, you got 3 books, up to 600 plus experiments that support all these, adoption. There were many adoption case studies that are available, written by people that actually were in the trenches doing it. So there are principles and frameworks and guides and experiments. If you ever want to read these books, I would recommend going in this sequence first, the green book, because it's easier to read. It talks about principles and frameworks. These 2 actually talk about guides and experiments. Very long list of experiments. Will make you like a very different thinker once you read it, but I would recommend starting with the first book. It's easier to. So what is large-scale Scrum, and what is the size of large-scale Scrum adoption? They may require a couple months of prep work. And again, we cover this just to much deeper extent during less training, but also you need a less coach or less adoption expert to help you with the first initiatives. We roughly talk about 70 plus minus people involved on dev side. Why? Because if you take Scrum team that is 3 to 9 people, recommended number, and multiply the upper limit by up to 8 teams, you have roughly 72 people, give or take. So I would usually prefer to say scale, make it a little lower. As I mentioned, 2 to 8 teams. Key and on point, very important. One product owner, one product backlog, and one and only one person, and one backlog. okay? And of course, in the end, one and only one potentially shippable product increment. Now, let me just take a look at the time. I'm going to kind of zoom through the next couple of slides. I'm just going to give you a couple of anchors so you can understand and appreciate the uniqueness. And well, I shouldn't say uniqueness, because if you understand Scrum, you will realize that large-scale Scrum is Scrum. And large-scale Scrum, by the way, this is an important point. I don't have a slide for this. Maybe I should. Large-scale Scrum is not a scaling framework. Let me pause and say it again. It's not a scaling framework. It is a descaling framework. Yes, it will ultimately scale goodness. We scale what a single Scrum team can do by adding more teams on the same product out of the same backlog for the same product owner. But in order for this to work, we need to descale our organization. We need to remove some of the waste and debris and some of the bureaucracy and what sits in between to make this happen. It's like you're building a house, a skyscraper. You can't just put it on the wobbly soil with lots of debris. You have to clean it out. So please think of large-scale Scrum as a descaling framework. This is the ongoing message. This is, I guess, this is the strongest message that I, as I go through my events and webinars and teaching, I try to stress it again and again. Think of large-scale Scrum as a way to descale your organization, to simplify it, which is almost empirical and inevitable, especially during these times when you have COVID and we have everyone goes virtually. The question comes, well, how can we maintain this organizational complexity online? Well, you should have thought about it when you were making yourself lean and more nimble. You should have done this during good times. So these are just the anchors, but think of them so make a mental note here. In large-scale Scrum, these are the relationships. I'm sure you are very familiar with these. This is the very important one. Direct, short catwalk between customers and users and teams. No boundaries, no intermediate layers, no translators. How and what, of course, we need to discuss it at length, but it is much easier done than we think. It's easier said than done, but it's not so difficult to do if we properly design an organization. That's what the less adoption catwalk, or runway is a few months before we flip the switch to go to less sprinting. Very direct between the product owner and teams, no conduits, no proxies, any of that. On point. Clarification flows as much as possible directly from users and customers onto teams. Prioritization, of course, goes the typical route. Request to product owner become prioritization mandates coming onto teams. The details of dynamics and the real how, the logistics, obviously yet to be discussed, but just make that aha moment. Hopefully it will be an aha moment. Oh, our users not allowed to set priorities or ask for a favor, hush hush on the table. Only prioritization. Oh, and by the way, a team member shouldn't be asking for permissions. There's a very short catwalk, either next door, next cube, or a phone, or a video call. I'm sure some of you guys can read SQL probably better than I do. I admire if a company actually takes seriously the need of supporting agile roles organizationally, systemically. And if you actually see a Scrum Master or a product owner as a job title, would give a lot of applause, with bow. But oftentimes we see these very, this is an irony. So this is a cartoon. Okay, hopefully you understand. When you run in this SQL query against a database table in a HR table, and you're basically relabeling old roles with new roles based on seniority. If you see this happening, it's a first flag. It's a first example that someone is playing a game. They're really not taking agility, and they're not taking Scrum seriously. Because in large-scale Scrum, for example, the role of a Scrum Master, just as an example, is a full-time role. It's a team-level coach, very senior, very seasoned. There are certain expectations that we're not covering today. But he or she their focus will change over time from team and product owner, from the teams and the product owner onto development practices and org design. We cover this at planning when we actually teach less. right off the last website. Very frequently misunderstood role. It's not the role, a Scrum Master, that is, for leftover people. Oh, this person has nothing else to do. Let's just relabel them and put them on the team and call them a Scrum Master. In order for this to be successful, we actually need to think of a career path for a Scrum Master. No jokes. You really, and some organizations have done it. A few investment banks have done a great job introducing the role. Teams. I'm going to say this very briefly. Think of this as a matrix of team maturity. X-axis, the degree of self-management capability, and the Y-axis is things that you can do as a team. You can read for yourself. Of course, if you are here in the low left quadrant, when you are managed by a manager, you can at most do individual tasks that are being assigned to you. In large-scale Scrum, we want teams to be at least self-designed. So, in fact, again, a big aha moment. In large-scale Scrum, we make teams self-design based on the blueprint we have helped them to identify. So, at this juncture, they can do much more than just execute tasks that have been assigned to them. Okay. Again, it's a loaded slide, and pretty much every slide here is very loaded because it requires a dialogue. Super loaded slide, and this is probably where I'm going to pause because some additional slides that will be mostly just fast forwarding. Here's an example of we speak at length when we teach large-scale Scrum. We have to understand the degree of dysfunction and local optimization that we typically see with the component teams, what we see on the left-hand side. This is a sneak preview. Imagine Team A being able to only work on component A, Team B only on component B, C only on C. Together they have the system built. Imagine how much post-Scrum, post-sprint integration that's required, because each team does their own thing. How much fallout you will expect from integration sprint and hardening sprint and stabilization sprint, and I cannot go to production yet sprint, blah, blah, blah sprint. But there's so much more about this, right? If I was a product owner and Team A was working only on component A, I would say, okay, so at least you guys are working on something that's high in priority in my backlog. Oh, by the way, I cannot prioritize it myself because it's very technical. So I need a technical lead to help me understand what this is. And by the way, this isn't just a one-off item. The whole backlog is like this. But what the hell is Team C doing now? Well, they're working on item number 4. But why? It's in the backlog all the way down below. Well, because there's nothing else they can work on. It's a component team. So imagine you had 100 items there, and you got 7, 8, 9 teams. We would have a team that works on on the component item number 85. A, very low in priority. B, your product owner can't prioritize it against anything else because they just don't understand it. And C, a component C, that team is actually very, very efficient at what they do. They're local optimized to do the best they can, to work the best they can, and the output is huge. They just work more and more of those components. If they're done with the component number 85, they're going to go to component 95, the same component, because this is what they can do. Okay, and this is what we typically see with these large frameworks where we don't pay attention to customer-centric development, where proximity is very low between a customer and Gemba, where you have Fractal Scrum, whereas each team has the TOO as opposed to a real product owner. So we can call it Scrum, or we can call it a squad, or we can call it a pod, or we can call whatever the fancy name we can give it. But if the underlying dynamic does not change, then not much is going to change. Now, I'm just going to say this. On the right-hand side, you see a true feature team. In fact, a few teams are being able to touch multiple components. And you may have many more teams, and you can have a much bigger backlog. When I say many more teams, I don't mean indefinite. In large-scale Scrum, we usually recommend no more than 8 teams, but they can touch multiple components. At any point in time, any team should be able to take any of the backlog items from a backlog. How do they do this? How is it even possible? Of course, these are the typical questions we get asked, and they're relatively simple to explain and understand how. but we actually have to cover it in slightly more depth. But the whole idea is this: I'm a product owner now, and I'm comfortable that any team at any point in time works on stuff that is most convenient, most important to me as a business person, as a product owner. And each one of these teams is focused on systemic global optimization. They are trying to do the best they can for the whole product, not for a single component. So the risk of having locally optimized high input, high output team are much lower, because each team works almost like it's the same mission, the same vision, same goal, same prerogatives. One single product owner, the same backlog for everyone. Okay. Now, what I'm not going to cover today, so we have some time to do a Q&A, is this. When we teach less, and less is Scrum. So I'm going to pause again. I'm going to make this as a very strong statement. Large scale Scrum is Scrum, where a single team is treated as a organizational building block. And the intention of large scale Scrum is not to scale, although it has the word scale in it. It's meant to descale so that product development is more efficient and effective and customer centric. But in large scale Scrum, when it all comes together, sometimes when we talk about different less events, how does it actually take place? How do these teams work together, coordinate together, cooperate, help each other? So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. There are some events where entire teams come, and there are some events where specific team representatives come, not Scrum Masters, not managers, not some odd people with odd roles. The actual team members and representatives, like for instance, the overall backlog refinement session. So this is where we send representatives, and this is where whole entire teams are participating. I know the question is, how is it manageable? How it's very manageable. It's very doable if you have proper people involved. Okay. We have lots of Gemba and lots of coordination directly with users and stakeholders. We use open space permits. So I'm going to actually fast forward these slides so you can have a few aha moments, and hopefully will generate some additional questions. Like in large scale Scrum, estimation is done by an entire less product group, whether it's virtual or all collocated, of course, much more preferred. Now think of it from a standpoint of accuracy and ability to budget and ability to forecast. Would it be more or less accurate? My argument would be it's going to be much more accurate, because you don't go through multiple layers of management to buffer and to fudge and to adjust your estimates. It comes actually from doers. Okay. More about events, sprint planning. Again, the beige section is for representatives, and some so sprint planning 1 and 2 is like the what and the how, just thinking Scrum. Again, very delicately and very swiftly can we structure this if we know who's going where and why they're doing it, without adding additional roles to it. We're really sticking to only to less product group people, only the people that work on teams with some additional minimal users and the product owner as needed. Okay. And of course, the review and retrospective. There was something that we add on top of typical Scrum events, which is called overall retrospective. It's a very organizational event, and it has Scrum Masters and some senior managers involved, because we focus on organizational design issues. Okay. Again, these are very loaded slides. Do not think just by looking at the slide it will be, I get it. We'll go ahead and implement. You need to really have much deeper conversation about this. And I think what is in this slide, so yeah, this is a bad pass-through slide. Just keep in mind something else. In large-scale Scrum, we have some great opportunities to collaborate and work directly, between teams and between individuals. The word community means a ton in large-scale Scrum, not a typical quasi-community, or what's sometimes referred to as a chapter. you take a horizontal structure, a vertical structure, and flip it on the side. It is much different in nature. It's by volunteering only, and it's for functional learning only. So that's a pretty, so the last few slides I realized it's almost like a deeper dive into large scale Scrum, although we just scratched the surface barely, and I'm not going to try to pretend that we can cover more in the last 6-7 minutes. So I'm going to leave it up to you now, and I'm happy to take a few questions, although there could be additional questions I can take after the call.
Okay.
Thank you. Back to everyone.
Yes, I'm back. Thank you very much, Gene. That was very enlightening. And so before I take some questions from the candidates, I have one question. So many organizations maybe have this false dichotomy, right? We are huge enough or large enough that we got to scale. And that's when they start and they pitch into the scaling. So can you throw at least 1 or 2 points? What are the preconditions for scaling, so that it is very helpful for some of the audiences on the call?
Yeah, sure. We are good candidate. We're a good patient to be scaled. Well, in my experience, this is fundamentally the wrong problem to solve. If an organization comes into this discussion with the notion we need to scale up, this may be a wrong intention, because that automatically assumes that what they do at the moment is great or good. So scaling means amplifying some goodness. So if an organization is dysfunctional or has some challenges at its core, and you're trying to scale on top of it, you're just going to scale dysfunction. So for instance, not changing organizational design or team design and team dynamics and trying to scale that, you'll just amplify problems. But needless to say, of course, with a larger, so if you have a large organization that has a large products and complex product development, you may consider Scrum and on large products, it would be large scale Scrum to do development. However, you need to be very clear about how you define your products. So defining your product well and appropriately and properly at the beginning will dictate how you will blueprint your team, how you will build your teams, and how you build your less product group. If you are not changing the ways you work and how you deliver value to your customers, then naturally the whole idea of structuring teams as feature teams is going to go right out the window. What's the purpose? Just for having them? Well, no. I mean, if organizational design and the way you deliver to your customers remains the same, then least likely you're going to see advantages of working as Scrum, as large-scale Scrum, as feature teams. So this is
so the starting point is to define the product in terms of the customer domain.
Yeah, so it would be one of the important things, how to start. We have a set of bullets, like a simplified list. What do you do to begin? You most definitely need to have a proper conversation with appropriate people organizationally that are in charge of organizational design decisions, because some of these less product group modifications require senior management support, and not just in spirit and and writing a check, actually doing Gantt, but going and seeing where action is and making these changes. And when we say scale, when we say enterprise and large scale Scrum, we don't immediately say thousands and thousands of people. And now we're going to call them so-called Scrum teams, and we'll put them in Jira, and off we go. Now we have scale. No, we want to go deep and narrow as opposed to broad and shallow. In large scale Scrum, this is one of less adoption principles. Deep and narrow as opposed to broad and shallow. Top, bottom, and bottom up. That's why we need senior management support, not in spirit, but actually in action. And it's also by volunteering. So we cannot force you or me or Arun or anyone else in the call to become a part of a less team, team in less or less product group. We have to do it by volunteering. We have to allow people leave. So there's another big discussion about how do you let people out or in of the less product group when you build it. It's all by volunteering. It is easier than people think. It's probably easier said than done, but when you even do it, it's still relatively easy as long as you have senior management support.
Okay. Thanks. And there is a follow-up question.
Please.
from Fadley. So he's interested to know why organizational structure needs to be emphasized more than the agile culture or mindset.
Because, well, I could refer probably to Luhrmann's laws of organizational behavior, and the number 5 law says culture follows structure. But let me put it this way. We may act like the 4 of us, the 5 of us, or as many people we have on the call. We may have a very, high degree of personal maturity and individual cultures, right? Come from different native cultures. If we're being thrown in the organization, in the dynamics that requires specific behaviors and specific norms and specific HR policies, we're going to act according to that organizational settings. Now, once we walk out of the company, or walk out in the street, we're going to become ourselves. So there was no miracle about this. We're humans, we're individuals. Change in organizational structure is the most important thing. If you have 10 layers between a doer and a manager that makes decisions, and a doer is not allowed to speak to a manager because it goes against subordination, or if their individuals are being incentivized based on individual performance as opposed to team performance, how do you think people will actually behave? Like you and I on the same team, and we both have said, we're both being told, hey, you guys are competing for the same bonus pool, your individual performance. Oh, by the way, still, would you please support each other in cross-functional development? I'm not going to teach you, you're not going to teach me, and we're not going to learn from each other because we're all competing. So those are organizational design elements that need to be taken into account.
Thank you, Gene. So in the interest of time, I'm going to take one more question. What are the major companies who have been successful with the less implementation? Maybe
let me do a better, so less adoptions are not meant to be very widespread, industry-wide everywhere, because they actually require, at least not yet, because they do require some changes, organizational design changes that not every company is willing to go through. This is why we see lots of, faux Scrum or fake Scrum, or these large monolithic frameworks that are very easy to unpack and install without changing much. However, if you go to lessworks, website I'm still sharing, right? You can see how many different case studies have been written from different industries: telecom, fintech, investment banking, that is, product companies, insurance companies. And these are not sponsored case studies. These are not case studies that are sanitized and made look pretty for success. These are written by real doers, and that's why some of these names are not real names. But you can probably ask the person offline what's what. So I would suggest referring to these, right? And yeah, thanks for sharing there. And those companies that are really in business of succeeding and retaining market share, and being successful and beating competition and being adaptive and nimble, those are the companies that are potentially more interested in large scale Scrum. And frankly speaking, the whole discussion is about framework, about scaling problems. Imagine this: you've had a company that had a very monolithic, very heavy, very cumbersome scaling methodology on a good day, pre-COVID, with lots of bureaucracy and confusion and things being, lost in translation, while people were all in the office seeing each other, talking directly. Imagine all of this being put on virtual, in virtual reality. Imagine this bureaucracy now becoming almost invisible. I mean, think of it from a standpoint of a stockholder or stakeholder or a business person or a CEO. Would you feel comfortable that your company is so, heavy, monolithic, and bureaucratic, and now you can't even see it? So nimble, light-footed, more adaptive, more agile ways of working. Even if you put people in virtual reality, you're probably going to have a lower probability of things falling through cracks and becoming invisible. Just the nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Jane, for sharing that. In the spirit of time, I'm going to skip a couple of questions. Thank you, Gene, and all the participants. I think Gene can be reached directly on LinkedIn. You can add Gene on LinkedIn. And you can also refer his website, keystep2success.com. That's one of the ways to reach out to Gene, and you can ask any questions with regards to LESS. And there is a LESS community that he talked about. This recording of this video is available. You can go through the meetup information. You can be a member, and I think he does a lot of LESS meetups in the US. So you can be a part of that. So hopefully some of your questions would be answered. I would like to once again thank Gene for spending more than an hour with us, sharing some of your experiences, especially on last.
My pleasure. And I realize there's some questions that were not answered, so I welcome people to join here on Slack. I mean, that's the quickest you can get, right? I mean, I respond very frequently to it, and I'll be happy to pick up any one of those questions or any of the above mentioned channels. I'm happy to have people.
Thank you. And on a closing note, there are some exciting speakers lined up. Melissa is talking about storytellings and the power of storytelling in cultural change, followed by Ral. Scrum.org PhD is talking about the product owner demystified. And Peter Stevens, a CST with Scrum Alliance, is talking about 3 secrets of agile leadership at the end of this month. So please do not miss any of this. This is absolutely a community initiative. And I would like to once again thank all the crew members, participants, and Gene for being here with us. I look forward to seeing you sometime, probably in a better situation after this COVID. Thank you very much.
And by the way, I strongly recommend all of these 3 folks, Melissa, Ralph, and Peter. I know them as great provocative speakers. So yeah, I actually like the fact that you sharing this now. I strongly recommend these folks as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. And once you have a link to video, I would be actually interested in having one, so I can maybe share it further.
Sure,
and,
sure.
It's a great undertaking that you guys are spearheading here.
Pleasure is ours. Thank you very much.
Stay safe, stay well, and we will be in touch. Okay.
Yep. You too. Bye bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Likewise, Steve. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye. Oh, and I will share my deck with you shortly. I'll zap it and I'll put it on my website perhaps, and you can take it from there.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.